to you, Peter.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Joe, for this invitation. Donegal is a long way from Sligo. And we don't often get here, so to be invited is great, as opposed to being thrown out. I haven't worked in Ireland for many years. I haven't worked in Ireland for over 30 years. I work now in Italy in the European Institute in Florence. And so when I look at Ireland, I look at it largely from the outside. And when I look at it in terms of how it's different from other countries. I work on elections and I work on parties. I study governments. And so I look at elections and parties in Ireland sometimes and wonder in what ways they differ from those in other countries. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But one thing I wanted to say at the beginning, I want to make two remarks at the beginning. One of them is to say that a lot of what we're talking about here is actually the same as is being talked about in other countries. The crisis may not be as deep in a country like the Netherlands or in Germany or in Hungary or wherever it might be. Perhaps it is as deep in Hungary now. And it's deeper perhaps even in Greece or in Spain. The crisis may not be as deep, or it may be deeper, but the issues of accountability and the need to discuss accountability is common to all of these countries at all of this time. Accountability is not just a buzzword in discussions like these, it's a buzzword in academic circles, and academics like me can make a living almost going from conference to conference talking about accountability. There are books on accountability published every month. It's a growth industry in itself. So in a sense, the problems we face in accountability, we face in Ireland, are shared by all countries. And there are good reasons for that. Politicians, not just here, but I think in any European country, no longer know how to represent voters. And they no longer know what voters want or what voters are saying. They try to respond to voters. And for me, accountability is the flip side of representation. In order to represent people, you have to be accountable to them. And if you're properly accountable to them, you give them proper representation. Good representatives are accountable, bad representatives are unaccountable. So when representation works well, accountability works well. And one of the reasons why accountability is problematic at the moment is that representation is working extremely badly. People don't know what voters want. It's not just here, but in other countries too. People don't know how to listen to voters. Voters don't know how to articulate their demands. Voters don't know what voters want, let alone politicians not knowing what voters want. So politicians have to try to listen to voters who are themselves inarticulate, and politicians are also having to listen to other institutions and to other masters. They listen to the European Union, they listen to the European Court of Justice, they listen to the World Bank, they listen to the IMF, they listen to the markets, whatever that is, 3 men in a room with a lot of money, and they listen to the multinationals. And all of them are putting different pressures on governments. So governments more and more, not just here, but more and more in every country in Europe, are finding themselves caught between a rock and a hard place. The rock is an incomprehensive and incomprehending electorate and set of voters. The hard place are all of the institutions and multinationals and markets and agencies and commissions and whatever it might be, who are telling governments that they must act in a certain way. And nobody trusts governments to manage the gap between the rock and the hard place, and to steer us through the rock and the hard place safely. No government in Europe is trusted at the moment. No government in Europe is loved or has faith. As they would say in Star Trek, we are not alone. That's the first one. The second point I would make is that there is, in a sense, this is now putting it from a different perspective, we've got, in a sense, a surfeit, in one way, a surfeit of representation and a surfeit of accountability in Ireland. But it's all at the local level. I think yesterday's discussion, which I missed, yesterday morning's discussion was about this, and I missed it, but it's a very important discussion. Nobody in Europe is as well represented by his or her TD as the Irish voter. And no politician in Europe represents his constituency better than the Irish politician. But they do it on an individual and on a local level. All of the accountability in Irish politics, and there's loads of accountability in Irish politics, is at the local level. TDs represent voters well, and TDs are accountable to voters at the local level. If you don't do your job well as a TD, and I'm sure any TD knows this, out you go. Either you're defeated by another party's TD or you're defeated by your own party's TD. But if you don't do the job, and if you're not there on the ground all the time, you're gone. That's accountability. That is representation. There is maybe too much of it. Be careful of what you wish for. You might get it. And you might get too much accountability. But the problem is it all stays at the local level. And so we use elections in Ireland to control our local TDs, and we don't use elections to control our governments. And that is what the election should be about. It should be about alternatives presented to voters for running the country and for making important public policy decisions. But we don't use elections for those purposes. We use elections to select our TDs. And in that sense, there's lots of accountability at the local level, with the result is there is no accountability at the national level. There's accountability of politicians, but there is no accountability of politics. There is accountability of the individual TD, there is no accountability of the individual government. And that is one of the major problems that we face in the country. But let me come to the main theme I want to talk about. And I want to talk about three paradoxes of Irish politics which strike me in looking at Irish politics from the outside, some of the strange things in a sense. And they're partly paradoxes of Irish politics and they're partly cliches which are not true about Irish politics. The first paradox is this, that despite a gathering like this, where we have all of these people gathering on whatever it is, 26 degrees, I find hard to believe, but maybe 16 degrees, which is for the west of Ireland a good summer, gathered in a dark room listening to discussions about politics at a time of crisis and so on, when we should be at the beach in Portneuf and so on. There seems to be then an interest in politics, and we say, yes, Irish people are very interested in politics. And it's a popular belief that Irish people are informed, well-informed and so on about politics. But one of the paradoxes of this supposedly politically alive culture and politically engaged culture is that we have one of the lowest levels of participation in elections of any country in Europe. If you take the 20 West European democracies, Ireland ranks 5th from the bottom, with the United Kingdom, with Portugal, with Switzerland, with the lowest levels of turnout. We simply don't participate in elections. We might be very interested in politics, but we don't become engaged in elections. If you look at party membership, that's one of the main channels of representation. We want our voices heard, we should join parties, we should support parties, we should become active in political parties. If you look at levels of party membership, in Ireland they're about 2%. In other words, 1 in 50 voters is a member of a political party. That's, again, I think, the third lowest in Europe. Most other countries are much higher than that. Not, well, let's say much higher, because that's also falling in other countries, but most countries are higher than that. So in a country which has supposedly got a widespread interest in politics, what we have is a disengaged citizenry. We have a passive citizenry. And that's one of the problems, and always has been one of the problems in Irish politics. That's one paradox. Second paradox is that we have, on paper, and all of the electoral system, people love the Irish electoral system. People in Canada love the Irish electoral system. Anybody who talks about the Irish electoral system loves the Irish electoral system. David Farrell has made a career about selling the Irish political system, or trying to sell the Irish political system around the world, except that people tend to vote against having it in the end. But everybody loves it because it is one of the most open and least party-controlled electoral systems in the world. STV with multi-member districts and so on and so forth. So we've got a very open electoral system. And yet we have, and this is the paradox, we have a political class which is one of the most disciplined in the world. At least until recently, and there's been some fallout with the crisis and some dissent showing in Fianna Fáil and so on and so forth. TDs in the Dáil have always toed the party line. You do not break party ranks in Dáil Éireann. People in Britain break party ranks, people in France break party ranks, even people in Italy under the threat of Berlusconi will break party ranks. In Germany people will break party ranks. In Ireland they don't. They toe the party line. There have been very few rebellions against party leaderships in the Dáil. The rebellions might happen inside the party meetings, but in the Dáil there have been very few rebellions. There's very little evidence of dissent in voting patterns in the Dáil. There have been remarkably few, at least important party splits in the mainstream parties in recent years. So again, the cliches are not borne out. In terms of, at least within the political class, the Irish are not rebellious, they're deferential. The split is not the first item on the agenda, it's probably the last if it's there at all. What you have instead is deference, forelock touching, bowing and scraping, and a lobby fodder that does exactly what it's told to by its political leadership. And this is despite an electoral system which should give politicians all the freedom in the world to express their own opinions and to follow their own lines and to represent their own arguments and so on and so forth. Also, the Irish voters like mavericks. They elect Neil Blaney near here, they elect Michael Lowry and so on and so forth. Voters like mavericks. So there's nothing to stop individual politicians expressing themselves and expressing their opinions. But no, they defer. They follow their leaders into the lobbies, they do what they're told. So as well as a passive citizenry, we have a passive political class. And that's the second problem which we have. The third paradox is that again, we have a party system which we would think would be a very open party system. When party systems in Europe, I don't want to get technical on this, become stabilized by lots of factors, strong social basis, when the parties have strong social basis in the electorate, when there are strong ideological differences between the parties, when the parties are very polarized and so on, then you tend to get stability of party system and you tend to get parties grounding down like armies in a battle. In the Irish case, you don't have strong social bases within the electorate. The parties are not deeply rooted within the electorate. You don't have strong ideological differences. You've got historical differences, but not very current historical differences. You don't have much polarization. You might have a lot of personal enmity, but you don't have polarization. So we have potentially a very, very open party system. There's nothing to tie it down. And yet, paradoxically, we have one of the most stable and the most unmovable party systems in Europe. The party system we have now, as we look at it now, with voting patterns in the last election and so on, is almost identical to the party system of the 1930s, and is almost identical to the party system of the 1960s. Then, in the 1930s and the 1960s, when I was growing up in the 1960s, long before that in the 1930s, you had three main parties. You had Fianna Fáil, which is the biggest party. Wow, it's the biggest party now. You had Fine Gael, which was the second biggest party. It's the second biggest party now. A lot has changed. And Labour was the Cinderella, and it's still the Cinderella despite its hopes for future elections. But Labour has always had hopes for future elections, and it's always remained the third party. Now, new parties have come, indeed, in the past. Some of you may remember Clon na Poblachta coming, or Clon na Talún coming. Some of you may remember National Labour. I remember, Pat Cox will remember, the Progressive Democrats. Other people will remember the Democratic Left, which then took over the Labour Party. And people might in the future remember the Greens. But these parties come and they go. They go as often as they come. And entirely in contrast to Europe. All over Europe, new parties have come in the last 10 or 20 years and arriving in major positions and shaking up party systems for good or for ill, but at least they have been there. We've had far-right parties in Scandinavia and the Netherlands. We've had new conservative parties in France. We've had Berlusconi and Forza Italia in Italy. We've had left socialists in Germany and the Netherlands and so on. But in Ireland, despite the openness of the party system, and the unprotected nature of the party system, nothing. So that's the third problem. There's a lack of innovation and a lack of room for new ideas and a lack of room for new political styles within the party system. We have a moribund politics and a moribund political culture. So you've got a passive citizenry, you've got a passive political class, you've got a moribund political culture and a moribund party system. Now, why is that? Why doesn't this, as it were, why is there no change at this level? Why? And it's not just something of the last 10 years. This is of the last 20 and the last 30 and the last 40 years. The short answer, to my mind, and it's an easy answer for what is a complex question, and it's not fair giving easy answers because the questions are complex and they deserve complex answers, but not here in Glentees in the summer. The short answer is that politics as policy making, and this is something also what Bridget was talking about. Politics as policy making, the real core of politics. I'm not talking about the favours and the back scratching and the strokes and the couture and so on. I'm talking about politics of policy making, the people who decide what should happen to the banks, what should happen to the welfare state, what should happen to the hospitals, what should happen to the schools and the universities, what we should do in Europe. That real hard politics. That politics is disconnected from the citizenry. And it operates at one remove from the citizenry and voters and elections. The politicians don't operate at one remove. The politicians are very, very close to the people. But this world of policy making also operates at one remove from the politicians. They're also outside that loop. There's a world, this is a paraphrasing of French political sciences, there's a world of policy making and there's a world of public opinion. And these two in Ireland, in the rest of Europe, these two are growing apart in many ways. But in Ireland, they've always been apart. They've always been disconnected. And I think they're more disconnected in Ireland than in any other country I know. So why has, or in what way has Ireland been governed? Because it's been governed at one remove. It's been governed indirectly. It's been governed through a tendency to delegate political decision-making, key political decision-making, beyond the political class to other agencies or whatever it might be. And it's happened, you can see it at least, in three principal ways in the post-war years. And I'll mention these very briefly and then finish. The first way we see it, and this is not something in the 2000s or the noughties, it goes back to the 50s and the 60s and so on, is an excessive reliance by the political leadership on ideas and innovations and initiatives coming from the civil service. One of the things people often ask about Irish politics is how can you have such a competent political leadership given you have such parish pump politics? How do you get good ministers out of very localised politics? All politics is local, Tip O'Neill said, but policy making is national. And how do you get from the local to the national? Well, one of the ways you get from the local to the national, or one of the ways the political class has got from the local to the national, is that it has passed on and delegated an awful lot of its decision-making and its responsibilities to the civil service, rather than debating them in the Dáil and rather than engaging with those issues with citizens. In other words, it has let the civil service look after policy making too much. Now, civil services look after policy making everywhere, but they don't look after it in the same sense as they do in Ireland, with the right, with the initiative, with the ideas, with the whole dynamic of policy making coming from that. So when you look at major developments in Irish politics, major policy shifts in Irish politics, you won't find them often in the parties. And you won't find them coming through the electoral process, which you might find in other countries. You find them coming from individual politicians or individual civil servants and so on. Think of Lemass, think of Whitaker. So in other words, the political class is content to allow this, and everywhere we said the civil service runs the country, the political class is content to give the country to the civil service and say, run that for a while, we'll see you after the next election. There was no reason, in a sense, why politicians should become engaged with the civil service, of course, because politics wasn't ideologically driven, it wasn't partisan in that sense. So there wasn't a need to control the bureaucracy like you find in other countries and to try and mould the bureaucracy to some ideological purpose. Irish politics was very ideologised, and therefore you could rely on, as it were, technocratic government, which is what Irish politicians did. Secondly, another example of how politicians, in a sense, evade responsibility and delegate decision-making is one which I haven't heard talked about much here in this short time I've been here, but which, for an Irish person living abroad and for an Irish person looking into Ireland from abroad in the last few years, is in some ways much more eye-opening than the economic crisis and the financial crisis and the bankers. Who would have ever believed that bankers were going to be honest anyway? But you would believe the priests were honest, that the church was honest, and that whole pillar of Irish governance was honest. And that is also crumbling. I mean, again, my brother, who's a keen observer of Irish politics, said, talking to me the other day, he said, look at the world we grew up in the 1950s in Sligo. The three pillars of society were the bankers, the church, and Fianna Fáil. And he said, look at them now. Lots of things have changed. But one of the things which has changed has been what we have seen with the church. Now that is not something I will talk about, but one of the things that's very interesting is when you see what has happened with the scandals and so on to do with the church, you realise how much of state activity was given over to the church in the first place. an entire field of policy making and an entire field of policy implementation was passed on and delegated to the Church to run, as it were, on its behalf, but certainly without other forms of accountability. When the Ryan report was published, and when all of those details were published about the destruction of lives in institutions run by the Church, everybody said the Church lacks accountability. There should have been some way of holding the Church accountable. But the state gave that Church those powers. And the state is ultimately accountable for what happened in those institutions. But the state doesn't take accountability because the state passes it over to the Church and lets it run it. So that we've got civil service running policy, we've got the Church running policy. We've recently seen the bankers and so on, and the developers running policy. So you ask yourself, what do the politicians do? If everybody else is doing these things well or badly or whatever it might be, what do the politicians do? And the politicians in Ireland do very, very little. The politicians work at the local level. They're extremely hard working. The individual politicians work very, very hard. But our politics doesn't work. Our party system doesn't work. It's not, our elections don't work. We doesn't become a channel for change, for new ideas, and so on and so forth. We have, as I say, a passive citizenry, which is never asked about political issues. We have a passive political class, which never debate political issues. And we have a moribund party system, which cannot seem to absorb or cope or develop new ideas whatsoever. That is a problem which goes back a long way further than 2000 and the crisis of 2000 and beyond. It goes right back to the 1950s, to the 1960s, to the 70s, the 80s. It's a politics which has characterized my lifetime, and I don't see how that easily changes. So remedying that problem, remedying this problem of this moribund political culture and this passive political class and citizenry, remedying that involves more than simply changing constitutional structures or electoral systems. There's a tendency that whenever things get tough, you talk about the Constitution, because that at least avoids you talking about the real issues. What this requires is that politicians, individual politicians and politicians as groups and politicians as parties, need to take real control of the policy-making process, not abrogate responsibility to other organizations and sectors. They need to take control of the political process. It requires politicians to offer citizens real choices and real alternatives at elections, and to turn elections into public debates about the future of the country. It requires them to engage citizens in building new programs for the future. If we want to talk about solidarity of this generation for future generations, if we want to talk about pulling together to get out of the mess which all this has landed us in, we need to work together and we need to mobilize citizens behind these alternatives. We need to talk to citizens about politics and not just about favours. And we need to discuss real political issues and not just plot in corners. Thank you.